Hello and welcome to the Blood and Donuts podcast, where we talk pop culture and horror. Today, we look at the 90s. With me, as always, is my co-host and the head honcho over at Multi-Man Studios, Doug Calhoun. Doug?
Hello, Hunter. How you doing?
Doing good. How are you?
Good. I'm excited to talk about the 1990s and forward.
All right. So, starting out, would you want to recap where we left off of the 80s last week?
Oh, yeah. That was a real winner. We had such hits as Chud 2, Chud the Bud. I'm sorry, Bud the Chud. The Phantom of the Opera starring Robert Englund, which was fair. Leviathan, Shocker, Halloween Part 5, Revenge of Michael Myers. Warlock, good movie. One of my favorites, The Dead Next Door. It's definitely a shot on shitty movie. Excellent movie. And we can probably round it out with either Flesh-Eating Mothers or Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan.
So it sounds like leaving the 80s horror wasn't in the best of places.
I think leaving the 80s was probably for the best. Yeah, they really started off strong, had some really good slashers. 80s was the golden age of horror. If you were to take the 1940s with the rise of Universal and kind of compare it to the 80s, we're almost at the same level to me. And then it took a sharp dive around 88, 89.
All right. So let's just get into the 90s then.
Okay.
So what were the early 90s looking like horror-wise?
Well, we started off with the sequels galore. We had Child's Play 2, Exorcist 3, Gremlins 2, The Leatherface, that was Part 3 of Texas Chainsaw, Predator 2, Prom Night 3, Psycho 4, and my all-time favorite, Troll 2, which had absolutely zero trolls in it and some of the best acting you've ever seen.
It sounds like this isn't really where the 90s gets its identity horror-wise. It sounds more like what was left of the 80s kind of seeping into the beginning of the decade. And you always kind of get those transitional years between any two decades.
Well, I can say that in the 80s, 70s and 80s, the Italian cinema was really taking off. And I believe it had a lot to do with the Italian, I want to say it was more the government or politics of the Italian cinema that really kind of dwindled it down. I mean, they had free range back then to make whatever they wanted. They stole a lot of stuff back then. And in the 90s, I don't know if there was kind of a crackdown on it or what, but that kind of just died out. Like, for instance, probably one of my favorites, Cat in the Brain by Flucci, and that was kind of the last really vicious horror movies that was made, and that was 1990. Yeah, but after that, we had, like you said, the slew of sequels, pretty much anything you could think of, and that went on all the way through the 90s, all the way to 99. And I mean, it was sequel after sequel. Some of them were actually once a year. Like I know Witchboard, it was like every other year was another sequel. Same with I think the Howling series. I think it was like that. House, another one. Gosh, has so many freaking sequels, it's ridiculous. And yeah, so so that that's the way 90s started out. We had some good ones, but basically the sequels really took over. 91 to me was kind of a game changer because you had a lot more of the bigger name directors coming in. Like Martin Scorsese went and redid Cape Fear, and Cape Fear, that was a movie I think back in the 50s or 60s, and it's a really good movie. But Martin Scorsese with Robert De Niro, unbelievable. Total psycho, really good movie. Then you had Jonathan Demme doing Silence of the Lambs, which right there, I mean, they don't even want to call that a horror movie.
Yeah, more of a psychological horror.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's still in the name.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you're, eating people or skinning police officers and wearing their skin to get out of jail, yeah, it's kind of a horror movie.
Just a little bit.
little Texas Chainsaw there, you know.
Yeah, not too much though. Apparently.
So the next would be like 92. Just kind of jumping around here. 92. That gave us the end of the Evil Dead trilogy. We got to see Army of Darkness, and to me, Evil Dead 2 really solidified Bruce Campbell, but Army of Darkness, made him a staple for all B horror movies forever. He's still, to this day, people know him for that.
Got a lot of work throughout the 90s too.
Oh gosh,
that,
yeah. Yes.
Was it Xena? He was in Xena.
Yeah. Warrior Princess. Yeah.
Was it Attila? Because he had his own show. Or no, he didn't. He showed up in another show.
Jack of All Trades, I think, was the name of that one.
That's what I'm thinking of.
Mm-hmm. Peter Jackson, he did his Bad Taste movie, but that was more of a wiki thing. Nobody really knew much about that. His big break was Brain Dead. That was 92. Horror got to jump on the bandwagon of virtual reality when they took Stephen King's short story, totally threw Stephen King's short story out and just kept the name for Lawnmower Man.
The beginning of the 90s and somewhat the late 80s, more of the 90s, I think, it saw a lot of more independent filmmakers that have become big names today, like Peter Jackson that you mentioned, Mr. Lord of the Rings making, Brain Dead.
Yeah.
Which, if you haven't seen it, is one of the goriest movies I've ever seen. We have that. We have not really horror related. We also have Kevin Smith come up around that time.
Mm-hmm.
Arguably one of the most important independent filmmakers,
Yep.
especially of the decade.
Definitely a trailblazer.
Yeah, it's too bad his movies aren't any good anymore.
Oh, God. Kevin, I hope you don't listen to this. I'm sorry.
He lost his touch after the 90s, so it's fine. Getting off topic here, though.
93 really didn't have much to offer at all other than Jennifer Aniston. It was the very first Leprechaun movie, and that was her big role. A lot of people don't know that. They think Jennifer Aniston, they think Friends or whatever, and it was actually Leprechaun. And it's funny that there's so many big name Hollywood actors that came from horror movies. Brad Pitt came from a horror movie, Cutting Class. Kevin Bacon, Friday the 13th. Johnny Depp, Nightmare on Elm Street. So I want to say Leonardo DiCaprio was in some too, but I can't remember. But 93 didn't give us much to really focus on. 94 was to me a very cool movie that came out called Cemetery Man, and that's a very art house movie, and it's basically this guy that works at a cemetery, and the cemetery all the dead come back, so he's got to go out every night and put them back in their graves. So it's a cool movie. It's a lot about love and loss, and it's got a pretty neat story to it. Of course, 94 was one of the first really great horror, I guess you'd call it, comic book adaptations. Was The Crow, and of course, with the freak accident, we lost Brandon Lee, Bruce Lee's son, which I think he was getting ready to really blow up and have an amazing career, but was kind of cut short. 95, really the only thing I want to talk about that has to be the worst sequel. I would put it up there Troll 2 style, was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre: The Next Generation. Horrible movie.
Saw young Matthew McConaughey there.
Matthew McConaughey and Renee Zellweger. At the time, they were nobodies. But, give them another couple years, and they were huge. And it was funny that movie, they even knew it was bad. and they had their publicist kind of push it aside so nobody could see it. And it wasn't until, I wish I could remember the date, because I want to say Renee Zellweger or Matthew McConaughey had a big movie coming out, and somehow this movie kind of came out at the same time. And yeah, so a lot of people were rushing to see the new Renee Zellweger movie when it was god-awful Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. 96 was a really good year because The Craft came out, and that was a really good movie, especially for the girls. You know, girls didn't really have a lot of really horror movies that they could relate to.
Yeah, somehow horror, it tends to be like the most progressive and regressive genre possible when it comes to women, which is very strange.
Yeah, and it's taken a really funny turn, just to get off the top of the subject just for a second. It's taken a really funny turn that if you watch any horror movies today, the women are always the hero and the men are very, very weak. So it's really changed. And I don't know if it's a better thing. You know, you could have both. You don't have to have one or the other. But the Craft was a good movie. It was a all female cast, and it showed that even I'm trying to remember the weirdos had a place, and they were the weirdos, what they called themselves. Of course, let's see, that was 96 when that happened, and Peter Jackson, he made Frighteners, which I believe really took off, and he's one of those independent guys. Him and another two guys, Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino, they made the excellent vampire flick Dusk Till Dawn. That was an amazing movie. It was definitely horror, but it was a little bit of mixture of the Tarantino Rodriguez desert, madcap movie. And
going back to the independent filmmaker point, Quentin's I'd say Kevin Smith was one of the most important. Quentin's up there too. Pulp Fiction is an independent movie. So I think Dusk Till Dawn is too. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's an independent.
Well, that was their first. That was their first time to really get together.
Yeah, I can't. I don't want to say that's an independent movie, but I can't see a studio paying for it. So,
yeah,
a big one. So I'd have to look, but.
The VHS movement is not dead. Be sure to get all your VHS needs at ilovevideo.com. So, Wes Craven in 96, because you mentioned earlier that you'd like to talk about Wes Craven off the speaker, that you really want to talk about Wes Craven. In 96, let's just put it this way. In the 90s, horror was really kind of just dwindling out. I mean, they were still making the movies, and they were on, you go to the local video store, there was tons of movies coming out, but nothing was really catching anybody's eye.
And slashers in particular definitely kind of run their course.
Yeah, so, to me, one of the guys that he might not started the slasher craze with Freddy, but he was definitely a front runner. He was one of the granddaddies of slasher, and he kind of came back and he gave it a good boost to the horror genre. I mean, if you were to go back and say 94, 95 and look at the horror magazines like Fangoria, which is basically the only one that was out about that time. There was a few other ones, but not many. They were bad. I mean, the magazine itself was having a hard time. There wasn't any good movies. They were talking about Buffy the Vampire Slayer and stuff, or just whatever they could put together. There wasn't a lot going on. So when Scream came out, and it did just gangbusters, blew up. Everybody wanted to see it. I remember going and seeing that opening night, and they had actual people dressed up like the Scream Killer, running up and down the aisle. and you actually had to stand outside of the movie theater and wait just to get in. I can't remember a time after that we had done that before. I remember times before, but after, no. I mean, it was a different feel for this movie. It was unique. It was a diamond in the rough, so to say.
So you brought up 1994. To go back to that year for a second, It seems like Wes Craven had been trying to do this for a little bit, trying to turn the slasher on its head. 'Cause that's the year New Nightmare came out, which was one of the first more meta horror films, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it was definitely self-aware. And it was a good movie, but honestly, Freddy had kind of run his course. And it was a good spin on it to make it more, here we are making a movie about a fictional killer when the killer actually comes and starts killing the people making a movie, So it was different. I think that kept him afloat, maybe, as, a horror icon. And it was, don't get me wrong, it was a good movie. It's just, when people heard it was a New Nightmare, they weren't going, oh my gosh, I've never seen anything like this.
And, you could kind of, I feel like that's, in a lot of ways, what Wes Craven was trying to do with slasher almost kind of mimicked like music at the time. Like grunge was trying to reinvent rock in a lot of ways. It seemed like Wes Craven was trying to reinvent the slasher, but he just couldn't. Freddy just wasn't like the avenue to do that. But he found his Nirvana moment with Scream, it seems like.
Yeah. Well, it looks like 97, even though we had 96 and, Wes Craven was really blowing it up and you kind of thought, okay, maybe we're going to get something new. We kind of, I don't want to say backtracked, but we kind of went back into the same old line of movies. And again, when I say all this, I love all these movies. I can watch them over and over again. So I'm not bashing these at all. But I'm just saying that, they are what they are. So 97 was basically like monster and like space horror flicks. We had movies like The Relic and Event Horizon, which, I'll give Event Horizon. I thought it was very original. Alien Resurrection, The Bloody Ape, Anaconda, and, oh my God, American Werewolf in Paris. Oof, bad movie. And then we had our first, what I would call rip-off of Scream was I Know What You Did Last Summer. And, I guess I shouldn't say a rip-off, but it felt in the same vein as that, So, 97, to me, it should have been a better year than it was, and it really didn't do it. 98, the biggest part for me was Jamie Lee Curtis was brought back in the Halloween movies, and it basically wiped out everything after part 2. So,
I think that's the first time that was done. It's a pretty where they wiped all the past movies out. That's a big trend nowadays.
Yeah.
I guess it started with that one.
Yeah. Started with that one, and then
that one did it again.
Yeah, they did it again. What was that, like 2 years ago? They started Halloween up, and it was basically, hey, we're going back to part 2 again. And
I think that one gets rid of part 2.
I think you're right.
Yeah,
yes.
That one goes all the way back to part 1. Yeah.
So she didn't even make it to the hospital.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a pretty cool flick. And then again, horror movies are all about teen angst, and they really dug into it in 98. And that goes with, like you were saying, the grunge feel, stuff like that. You had Apt Pupil, The Faculty, Urban Legend, movies like that was all about teen angst.
You could say that Hollywood sort of finally figured out what the youth was like about 98 at the very end of the decade.
Yeah.
And started making movies trying to reflect that. Right.
1999,
It was a big year. I mean, that set the stage for most of the 2000s, really. That whole decade with a movie I know you really like, Blair Witch.
Yes, yeah. We had a few other big movies, and again, I'm from this time. I remember, going to the theater and seeing all these movies. Every weekend we were going to the movies.
I'm surprised you had time during 1999 to go to the movies.
I did. Well, you were born that year, but somehow we made it anyway. We saw Sleepy Hollow. I remember seeing that one particularly in the theater. I thought it was very unique. Tim Burton, amazing director. Still has it. He hasn't lost a beat. But he brought Johnny Depp back to his horror roots. Stir of Echoes, Kevin Bacon flick, real good and creepy. Another horror dude from he played in Friday the 13th. But like you said, the king for me for 1999 has to be the Blair Witch Project, because it's just. Before the movie even came out, they had Sci-Fi Channel had put a documentary on called The Curse of Blair Witch. And I remember sitting down and watching that with my wife. And, when it was all said and done, it almost felt like an unsolved mystery. Like we were going to go see something that maybe we shouldn't be seeing. Is this real? Who knows? Even through the whole movie, you're thinking this, oh my gosh, are these people really dead? And, it's not the first time that they did this in a movie. They did this years and years ago, back in the 80s with, was it Cannibal Holocaust?
I think that was 79.
Was it 79?
It
79,
was
80.
Really late 70s or the beginning of the 80s.
So, a lot of people say that these two guys that made Blair Witch ripped off Cannibal Holocaust. I see where they're coming from, but to me it's still a totally different movie.
Yeah, and talking about just accessibility too.
Yes.
Cannibal Holocaust is not an accessible movie. That is.
It's not a nice movie.
No, that's a movie I watched once, and that was enough for me.
Yeah, if you have issues with animal cruelty, that is not a movie for you.
I technically watched that movie on Easter, and I felt really bad about it.
Oh wow! You need to go pray.
I watched it late at night and turned it off, and it was technically Easter, and I was like, that was the worst movie I could have watched on Easter.
So yeah, the Blair Witch, like I said, it's a favorite of mine. I do watch it, a lot. I've seen it many times. To me, it's not really what you're seeing on screen; it's what you're thinking about. Hey, I'm in the woods. The people that I'm with, I don't really know. Can I trust them? What's out there? Could it be the Blair Witch? Could it be some hick? Who wants to make me squeal like a pig? You don't know. So and I think it's just a really creepy movie. Marketing standpoint, it was unreal. Just everybody was talking about this movie, and it was a love or hate thing. You either loved the movie or you absolutely hated it. And to this day, it's still a staple for other directors who want to do like a found footage movie. They got their idea from these guys, and it was basically guerrilla style filmmaking, because they would take the script and they would just take it to the woods and put it out there. So these people who are filming themselves would go and read it and say, okay, today we're going to do this. We're going to have somebody beating on our tent tonight. Or I don't even think they knew that. They just they said something's going to happen. So it was a really neat thing.
Yeah, and dollar for dollar, it was one of the most profitable movies to have been made up to that point.
Yeah.
The initial budget, I'm looking at it here, was $35,000, which is pennies. Once post-production was completed, the real budget was about $200,000, which in the film world is still pennies. Mm-hmm. The earnings for it was $25 million. So if you had happened to have been an investor on the Blair Witch, you made your money back in spades.
No doubt.
It's $250 million for a movie that cost $500,000 to make.
Well, you got to think the only other movie that you can compare that to would be Paranormal Activity,
which also did about the same thing as far as money goes. They don't compare anything to like money made by Titanic at the time, but
right?
Money for dollar.
Yeah, it was a better investment.
Yeah,
I would rather invest in the Blair Witch or Paranormal Activity than Titanic. Because it's going to cost me a lot more money to put in Titanic.
Yeah. I could actually put some money into Blair Witch.
Yeah, I think we all could.
Yeah, I couldn't actually put any money into Titanic.
Yeah.
I don't have that kind
If
of
they
money.
would have had a GoFundMe page,
Yeah,
that's how they would have made this movie. You know?
that's true. It would have. That kind of was that's the end of. Is that the end of the 90s?
That was the end of the 90s, and basically, there's tons and tons more movies that we didn't talk about, and there was some real stinkers in there, and there's some really good ones. Like one of my favorites that we didn't talk about was the remake of Night of the Living Dead. With Tom Savini did, and if you were to ask him, he said it was the worst experience of his life. But if you're a true diehard fan of horror movies, and you love Romero, that was a great movie. And it was a fun, cool movie. You had Shocker, you had all kinds of really good flicks. But basically the '90s were all about the sequels, no matter what. I mean, it just went on and on and on.
It was kind of interesting to look at the 90s like holistically, how it did start very, and the sequels did carry through the entire decade. But it did start very like, what's the word? Almost like factory-made movies, and it's like the culture at the time slowly seeped into it. The do-it-yourself nature of the '90s, to where it ended on Blair Witch.
Oh yeah.
Movie. It's just people running in the woods with camera. It feels like that's all it is.
Yeah, yeah. And it's funny you look at it that way, because I mean, you go back to the 1990 and you look at the sequels that were being, like Gremlins 2 and Predator 2. These are all big budget. They were blockbuster movies, and they were okay. I'm not saying they were bad movies, but to go from something like that to Blair Witch, that says a lot. And Blair Witch probably made more money than those movies too.
Comparatively, yeah.
Yeah. I think if I was to sum up, well, like I said before, if I was to give like an MVP to anybody, and I don't think we mentioned him at all through this whole podcast, would be Stephen King. Because if you're to go the list, if you were to look at a list from 1990 to 1999, there wasn't one year where he didn't have at least more than one movie or miniseries or whatever, anything. The man was all over the place. He really kind of owned the 90s. If you look back at his work, well, I don't want to say his work because
the
a lot of times
he
he doesn't come say they're good, and they're not. But
I was gonna say I don't think much is remembered of his movies from the 90s except for maybe the It miniseries.
Yeah,
it's the only thing people still talk about.
Yeah, that was early to mid 90s, and yeah, if you ask a child of the 90s, that terrified them. It was good, but he had I think The Stand was in the 90s. There was another one, I'm totally blanking out on it, but I mean, he was definitely the king of TV miniseries. They're always making miniseries about him. They did Red Rose and The Stand, It, and a ton of other ones.
Langoliers,
yeah, 90s. Yeah. Oh, they're doing The Stand again. It's on one of the streaming stations now. Yeah.
Do you have any ending thoughts on the 90s?
For me, the 90s were just okay. Honestly, if I had to pick a decade, I would definitely pick the 80s. To me, the 80s were the absolute best. That's the fun times. Everything. I know anybody who wasn't a child of the 80s would probably disagree, but to me, the music was better, the movies were better, the cartoons were better. They were just, everything was so much more fun. The 90s, I'm gonna be honest, I don't even remember much of the cartoons from the 90s.
Well, you were graduated high school.
Yeah, exactly. But if it was good, I'd watch it anyway. But yeah.
You're trying to tell me that hair metal was better than Nirvana?
Oh heck yeah!
Oh man,
hair metal, Poison. Give me some Poison, man. Now, I like, the 90s were good. The grunge. I like grunge. That was cool. Some of the rap, pretty cool. I mean, who doesn't love Vanilla Ice? Come on, man. He was the voice of a whole generation.
Oh man, going off the rails now.
Sorry. Well, what do you think about the 90s? You've been kind of studying them a little bit.
I think they sounded okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, compared to the 2000s, because you're a child of the 2000s,
I guess I am. That's funny, is I don't remember that much from the 2000s because I grew up watching movies with you.
Yeah.
We didn't watch much in the 2000s.
No, we didn't.
I watched a lot of stuff from the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah.
I watched cartoons from my generation, but I also watched G.I. Joes because I bought that.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up watching the G.I. Joes from the 80s.
Right. So you're almost a child of the 80s too.
I'm a secondhand child of the 80s.
Secondhand child of the 80s. All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening. I hope this was educational. Tune in again. Maybe we'll talk about the 2000s, or maybe not. We'll talk about the 80s again because it's so much better. Anyway, that's our show for today. This is Doug, a.k.a. Melting Man, and his sidekick, Hunter Calhoun. Thanks, y'all. Bye.